Using sources. So in an earlier video, I talked about Paul Grice's maxims of conversation. And one of his maxims is quality, which has two sub-maxims. One of them is don't say that which you believe to be false. All right, fair enough. We shouldn't lie to our conversational partners, right? Our recipients. But there's another maxim, the sub-maxim number 2 is don't say that for which you lack adequate evidence. That's the one that we're going to be focusing on here. Because in a research paper, the argument hinges on the evidence. Now, in this class, we're focusing on a secondary research paper, meaning that we're not doing an actual experiment or survey or study. We're using other people's research to found our own argument. In that case, our argument hinges entirely on the quality of the sources that we use. Now, in terms of organization, though, I find that many times novice writers will put the cart in front of the horse. Well, put the cart in front of the horse. Yes, I got that right. They'll put the cart in front of the horse. That is, they will focus on their sources rather than focusing on their argument. Right? So remember, the sources are there only to support your argument. So don't get in the trap of just simply focusing on the sources. Begin with the claims that you want to make, then back them up and ultimately back them up with evidence from your sources. I also want to think of this in terms of unmarked versus marked. Unmarked means it's the default. It's what's expected, and you don't have to say anything about things that are unmarked. So one way of thinking of this, I like to think about traffic, that when you're driving a car, the unmarked situation is one where your car is in motion, it's moving forward. But there are, of course, times when you have to come to a full stop. Those times when you come to a full stop are marked. And much of the time, they're actually physically marked, like with a stop sign or a stop light or a crosswalk, where it's understood that you can drive through the crosswalk as long as there is no pedestrian in sight. But if there's a pedestrian who's beginning to cross the crosswalk or even waiting on the sidewalk, you have to stop. At a yield, then you can proceed forward unless there's the marked situation of a car coming from the other direction, right? So there are all these different rules about traffic flow which rely on this idea of what is unmarked and what is marked. All right, in the same vein, our papers have some things that are unmarked, that are expected, that are the default, and we don't need to comment on them. We don't need to indicate it in any special way. So the point is that when we are writing a paper, if the ideas are coming from ourselves, that is, they're novel ideas that we came up with, the assumption is that's the default, right? And we don't have to indicate anything about that. We don't have to preface every one of our ideas by saying, I believe that, or I assert that. That's just taken for granted, so we leave it unmarked. We just state what we want to state. And we don't need to put quotation marks around it or anything to indicate that it's special. On the other hand, if they are somebody else's ideas, then there's two branches there. So in one case, we take somebody else's ideas, but we use our own words. That's the unmarked case when we're using other people's ideas. So if we're using other people's words, then we don't, again, need to indicate anything about the source of the words, but we do need to indicate the source of the ideas, which is to say we need to cite our source. So anytime we're getting our ideas from somebody else, we have to cite the source. But we don't need to say anything special about the words themselves because that's understood to belong to the writer. There's also this idea of the macro and micro is what I'm calling it. So the macro would be where we are simply summarizing. So imagine that in one sentence, you summarize the point of whatever source it is that you're using, right? That would be sort of at the macro level where you're summarizing, say, 30 pages in a single sentence. On the other hand, the micro range would be where we're just reproducing what they said. And in fact, we often find this, that writers will, when they're discussing other people's ideas, may have to use more words than were in the original because the audience differs. So if the audience is different from one source to another, then you need to change the wording. All right, now I use this arrow here to indicate that this is a continuum. So oftentimes in composition classes, they'll talk about summaries and they'll talk about paraphrases. Summaries fall in the macro level, paraphrases on the micro level. I find that to be too much of a simplification, that in fact it's a continuum, that it can fall anywhere in there. And where it falls depends on the purpose of why you're using that source. So, for example, if you simply need to get at the main point of your source, and it doesn't really matter how they got there, their evidence or anything like that, then you're going to tend towards the macro. Whereas when the evidence is crucial, we're going to tend towards the micro. And that depends on your purpose, what your claim is, and what you need in order to back up that claim. Then at the far end, we have others words. That's very marked. And we are obliged to mark it in more than one way. So when we use other people's words, we'll put quotation marks around it typically. That's going to be if it's less than about 4 lines of text. Under 4 lines of text, then you just use quotation marks and we cite the source. On the other hand, if it's particularly long, more than 4 lines of text, then we block indent. And either way, and of course we still cite our source, either way we're marking it, right? And so that's the unusual case. And it's also unusual because it's the last thing we want to do, right? That most of the time when we're using other people's ideas, we should put it into our own words because that's the expectation, but also because we know our audience. And the original probably wasn't intended for our audience. I'm going to leave it as an exercise for other reasons why we may want to, or for reasons rather, why we may want to quote. So what justifies using this more marked situation? Then I want to talk about how do we cite our sources. We're using APA for this class. And so we use parenthetical citations. There are other ways of citing sources. All of them operate under the same principle, that when we use other people's ideas or words, we have to indicate so. And it's always in text a shortcut. It's a shorthand. So we don't want to have to burden readers every time that we indicate a source with the entire reference. We save the references for the end of the paper in our list of references. Sometimes in some genres, they will use footnotes instead to indicate the reference. We use in-text citations in parentheses and then our list of references. So let me give you some examples of how this works. First one, where the author's name is part of the grammatical sentence. So Scullin, the article's author, argues that plagiarism is more complicated than commonly assumed. And then what we do is we've got this date right here in parentheses. That indicates that it refers to a specific article. And all readers need to do is follow this sort of code where they look for the author's last name in the list of references and the date, and they know exactly which source you are referring to. If there's a particular page that you can point to, then we put the page number right here. All right, so the idea is that if this is more macro level and you couldn't point to any specific page where Scullin says this, but it's rather the whole piece as a whole, it's the piece as a whole that does it, no page number. Whereas in this case, Scullin 1995-5 argues that research based on Goffman's work poses problems for the traditional view of plagiarism. I can point on page 5 exactly where Scullin says that. Sometimes we may not want to use the author's name as part of the grammatical sentence. In that case, we'll just put the parentheses at the end of the sentence, author's last name and date of the article. Traditional analyses of plagiarism make certain assumptions that are controversial. Scullin 1995. And again, if you can point to a particular page, then you put the page number. Modern definitions of plagiarism are inherited from Kant's philosophy on the ownership of ideas. Scullin 1995-3. And sometimes we may want to quote. And again, we have two choices. We can use the author's name in the grammatical sentence. Scullin 1995-4 writes, studies of plagiarism tend to be polemical in nature, condemning the plagiarist on the basis of wickedness or incompetence. And again, since it's a quote, obviously we can point to a particular page, so we have to have that page number. We don't have to put Scullin in the sentence, though. We can put Scullin at the end. Studies of plagiarism tend to be polemical in nature, condemning the plagiarist on the basis of wickedness or incompetence. Close quotes, Scullin 1995, page 4, parentheses around that, and then a period at the very end. And I want you to notice that. The period always comes after the citation. The citation is understood as part of the punctuated sentence. So the quotation mark ends here, and then we've got our citation, and then the period. Or in this case, we've got the statement in our own words, and then the parenthetical, and then the period. And then, of course, whenever we cite a source, we must include it in the list of references. And since I've been quoting and citing, rather, Scullin, I need to give the entire reference. So the reference has to include certain elements like the author's last name. That's going to come first in our list of references. Then the author's first name following a comma, period, the date. And remember, the date is how we know which particular source it is. So we may be having more than one source from Scullin, but we need to include the date so we know which source it is. Then the title, Plagiarism and Ideology, Identity and Intercultural Discourse, and then the source text. In this case, it's a journal, Language and Society, volume 24. If there's an issue number, there wasn't for this particular journal, but if there's an issue number, we would put that in parentheses following the 24, and then finally the page numbers. All right, this is going to be slightly different if you have a book or if we're using a chapter from a book. I'm going to include a link for going to a source on how to use APA style that will give you all of the niceties of it. But these are the main things. And the idea is that a reader, with all of this information here, could easily find the source article. So with you've included enough information that they can unambiguously identify the source article. And that's the crucial thing, is that a reader should never be in doubt about whose idea it is, whether it belongs to the writer or it belongs to a source that the writer is using. They should never be in doubt about whose words they are, whether it's the writer's words or whether they are the words of some other source. So we always need to mark these things when they are in a marked situation. And whenever we cite our source, we have to include a reference for that source.